everyone, and welcome to Module 2 of Legal Research. And this week we're looking at the importance of your research question, actually being able to define what it is that you're trying to do. Now, in the world of assignments, quite often this is a given. You're given the topic. But even within those parameters, what you do with that topic, how you define it, and how you focus on the key parts of those questions is very, very important. And often where students go off the rails is at this very early stage. It's where they don't spend enough time focusing on the planning stages and don't spend enough time sharpening and focusing that research question. So, for instance, in this term we're looking at the committals issues paper, and the question that I'm going to answer in class, we're going to use as an example, is a really bad question. It is a terrible question, but unfortunately it's the sort of question you often get set as an assignment topic. And that's the first one in the issues paper, and that is, what is the purpose of a committal hearing? Now, that is a topic which, as we will see, as we explore it, is full of traps. And it's unfortunately it's also the sort of topic that often when given a choice, students will go, oh, that looks nice and simple and straightforward, I'll do that one. And we'll illustrate in the workshops why that isn't the case. So even when given one of these, and honestly this is a really bad question to get, I wouldn't give it to you guys, even when you do get it, you can actually shape it into something that has more form, that is more answerable, that is more than just a vague exploration through a topic, which is what this question encourages you to do, really. So this week we're going to look at some of the bad habits that we have, that we learn as students, things we do like padding, prevaricating around a topic, spending the first 500 words or a page just talking about the topic and not actually getting into it, edging around the issue, and various other things that we do that often are the result of bad planning, and sometimes they're bad habits we pick up just through the experience of education, and we see these as ways of adapting to the challenge. We go, well, if I write 500 words on this and 200 words on that, it'll pad out the assignment, I'll get to 2,000 words more easily. But in reality, you're actually depriving yourself of the opportunity to actually achieve more with that paper that you've written. So we're going to look at some strategies around that. So again, one of the reasons why we're using the ramp model and the structure of this term is to look at the way in which any project benefits from the time to work through it in stages with the ability to think and reflect in between. And these are the things that working on an assignment the night before it's due, you don't have time to do. And this is not meant to be something that's just, nagging you about your bad habits, because everyone has bad habits. But it's about being able to get on top of these things and do better at what you do, and not just spend your life barely scraping through and not understanding why it is other people are doing better. So we should think about a research paper as a machine for communication. Shouldn't just be this sort of shapeless blob of text. It should be really focused on what its purpose is, and every piece of it should be an efficient part of that machine, and it should be part of communicating those ideas and making a case, and making a strong argument for a particular position. So for instance, let's look at that topic that I'm choosing for myself. How could that go wrong? What is the purpose of committal hearings? Well, you could spend half a page talking about why you're looking at the purpose of committal hearings. You could spend another half page talking about why the Victorian Law Reform Commission is looking at it. Maybe you could look at what the Victorian Law Reform Commission is. You could define it. You could look at its legislation. Well, that's good. You've filled almost 2 pages now, only 2 to go. All right. Well, there are very many different purposes for committals. These include A, B, C, and D. And you go through and describe A, B, C. Oh, and you're out of 4 pages. Now, that may seem like a success because you've reached your 2,000 words, your 4 pages. And hey, I can hand it in and maybe I'll even pass that. But the problem is you've missed an opportunity to actually develop something meaningful and to work on those skills. So we'll look at some strategies as to how to avoid that, particularly when you're given those bland, broad subjects lure you into those bad behaviours, into being really descriptive and just spending time doing what's effectively show and tell. I mean, I don't know whether kids still do show and tell anymore, or if this is a metaphor that works at all, but that, like, I've brought along a thing up to class and this is the thing and this is what it is and I'm going to describe it and then I'm going to put it away. And that's not what we're here for. That's not what we want to do. We want to look at, well, what is the live issue? What are the questions? And then how are we going to break those down into something that we can answer? So ultimately, we're moving beyond description and we're using as little description as we can, just what we need to make sure that the reader and I and the author are on the same page. And then we're looking at what do we want to do? We're not just informing, we're persuading. We're arguing a particular point of view and we're arguing for a particular perspective, even on what seems to be a reasonably bland issue. There's still some place from which you can say, this is what I want you to think about it. It might be worth spending a little time talking about the different types of legal research and some of the types of research questions that occur in law, because they're seldom the sort of questions you tend to get at university, which are contained and very sort of based on the things that you already know out of your readings, and you can do a little bit of extra research, but are very much based on the realms of the known. Real research questions are very much into the realms of the unknown. So I'm just going to run through a few of these here. You don't need to remember any of these, but just to get an idea of the sorts of questions legal researchers ask. So first of all, is the law right? No, regardless of whether it's a big issue, if it's just or unjust or whatever, but does the law work? Is it functional? There's different ways of critiquing the effectiveness of law, but does it do what you want it to do? And that in some ways those are easy questions to answer. Questions like, should marijuana be decriminalised? And everyone has very strong emotive positions on that, and we can very easily get into what those arguments are. But the problem with those questions is also you can get distracted from the legal questions and the questions of well, what does it mean actually for law, rather than just saying, well, this is my opinion and this is what I think. So those can be quite difficult research questions to handle. And sometimes the more technical questions are actually more straightforward for us to go about answering. The more straightforward questions are things like, why is the current system not working? And this is a key one for the committals paper. Why are there big delays in the system? Why is it costing so much money? What are those problems within that system? Part of that question is, what supporting mechanisms do laws need to be effective? So there can be all sorts of regulatory provisions that something that is a broad statement of law can make a change, but unless you actually make changes to all the mechanisms that support it, it doesn't actually help. So you can have a position where you say, we're changing the Australian internet laws, we're having internet censorship laws, but we don't actually change any of the laws that enforce censorship. So we actually have these broad symbolic set of laws that don't do very much, which is the situation with our internet laws. Which for a lot of people are very happy with that. A lot of people are very happy with a law that makes a very firm statement of standards and then doesn't actually interfere with anyone going about doing what they actually want to do. But it's costs a lot of money to make those kind of moral statements. So you then need to look at, well, what are the mechanisms that are needed? And in the committals space, we've got those policy objectives around committals, but we then have those really nitty-gritty questions about, well, who does the committal? How is it done? And you can see there's trouble brewing in Victoria between the Supreme Court and the Magistrates Court. It's all very passive-aggressive in the paper, but it's there in terms of who owns the committal process leading into the Supreme Court. And you've got some very interesting debates going on there, and you can only imagine what's going on behind the scenes. Another question that we ask is, what are the alternatives and how do we evaluate them? And this is often a very fruitful source of legal research, because you say, well, what does everyone else do? What do all the different jurisdictions in Australia do? How do we compare them? What criteria do we use to compare them? What happens overseas? So that's a very common research question, and it's one which sometimes it's pointless, sometimes it's comparing apples to oranges, and it's saying, well, what happens to the committal process in Japan? Well, it's the whole justice system works quite differently. we can't just look at that in isolation. But often, if we're looking like at different states and we can learn from what they've done, it's a very solid basis of research. Other questions involve resourcing and priority issues. We have different options, okay, but how are we going to resource them? And if we have limited resources, how do we assign those priorities? This happens a lot in the policing field, and often when people say, you know, there's not enough being done about, say, domestic violence, there's a finite number of police who are trained, who are available as a resource. We can train more, but it'll take time to train them, and it'll cost us to get more police. So if we are going to establish that more needs to be done about domestic violence, we also need to go through those questions of, well, what are we not going to police then? Are we going to police more effectively and more efficiently so we can use the same set of resources to do more? Some police may challenge the fact that they're not being efficient, but that's always going to happen within a system. Or sometimes, particularly in the justice system, it literally comes down to a question of, well, what do we prioritise over the other? And sometimes it means making a choice and saying, well, we can't do all those things at once. So sometimes legal research questions get down to those questions of priorities. And those are ones that I don't know that as lawyers trained in a law degree, we're necessarily very well equipped to investigate. But those of us who have got the skills in that sort of resource understanding and system understanding are very useful to those kinds of debates. The other kind of question you often get, and we definitely get here, is the multi-jurisdictional, multi-agency questions. And less multi-jurisdictional here because usually, you know, we're talking about committal for crimes that are committed in jurisdiction. It's not really an issue where people are committing crimes across jurisdictions, but across agencies and organisations, very important. So we've got an interesting three-way standoff between the Supreme Court, the Magistrates Court and the Director of Prosecutions in terms of what those three organisations' roles will be and what the role of broader ideas of case management are going to be. So, you know, these are not the sort of things I appreciate that you've covered in first year. This is not necessarily a question of, you know, which tort has been committed or is a contract valid. However, these are the sorts of questions that legal researchers are hired to do. Very rarely in practice is there much time spent researching things we already know. No one wants to pay you to research something we already know or that we could look up quite easily. So it's about those emerging fields and understanding the practice. And in terms of big questions, there's the question of, is the law likely to change in the future? And that's one that requires a lot of really high-level analysis and often a bit of experience to do it. So questions like the tort of privacy, which you may or may not have covered, has a very contested state in Australia. It's been recognised by some Supreme Courts, but it's not gone properly to the High Court. So you can have a research question is, what would the High Court do if presented with that question now? So, you know, you often have to be a professor with years of experience behind you, or an experienced barrister before you start trying to handle those questions. But those questions are very important, and particularly in the client context where a client says, is it worth me spending all this money taking something to the High Court? It's going to cost a lot of money. What are the chances? And that's the kind of research, high-level research analysis. And, I mean, there's also all sorts of other, let's go to the other end of the extreme, there are also lots of low-level questions that are asked every day that are not really research questions, but can be backed up by research. So, you know, in an everyday dispute, what are our chances of resolving this informally and quickly? Now, sometimes the legal research is very useful in that because you're able to say, well, I can present a really strong case here that if it does go to court, then we're going to win, and we can use that as leverage in a negotiation. But a lot of the questions that are part of that everyday, you know, that support that everyday question are not necessarily researching what the law is, but they're researching people and context and understanding. And it's like, well, is this person someone who's going to listen to reason, who if we present them with a strong case that they will negotiate? Or are they someone who is not going to negotiate? So there's no point us finding out a whole stack of legal authorities that support our position, because they're going to go to what they want their day in court regardless. So there's all sorts of everyday questions as well that are not about, what's the High Court going to do, that are about what's going to happen in this particular situation. Risk assessment in an organisation. Are we exposing ourselves to risk here? That all have legal research questions that tie into them, even if the ultimate questions of themselves are not necessarily what we would call legal research questions. So our first task when approaching any particular legal research problem is to look at that foundation, what our question is, and how we can shape it in a way that it's a question that will be beneficial to research, that we're going to get productive answers, and that is framed as a question with multiple sides and multiple issues. And this is what we'll be doing in the workshop this week. We're looking at the questions and how we actually turn it into, beyond a question of what is this show and tell, as to, well, here is the debate. And often it's two sides of a debate. It's being able to present, here's side A, here's side B, here's the evidence and support for each of the sides. Here is my judgment as to which is the most convincing side, backed up by evidence. And that's the format that we use. And we'll be doing more of this throughout the term, but it's about refining those skills and moving beyond what we start off with as novices, where we just sort of look up some information and regurgitate it back onto the page and hope we do well in it. And we actually look really seriously at the idea of that paper as a little machine, as a little engine that does something, and that we can actually make sure that every piece of it works well. So there's other stuff in the study guide this week. We look at the idea of wicked problems, and that extends some of these ideas about, when do problems become interdisciplinary? When do they become interprofessional? And when do we need multiple people involved in them? There is a little bit of information on law reform papers, which will hopefully help you understand the context that law reform exists in. And there's a separate video on the bedtime rule, but it's a little explanation for how precedents and rules work together that I've found helps people understand the interplay of those things. All right, so the workshop this week, we're looking at that idea of framing your question as a debate, isolating the different sides. We'll be using that rather awful question that I've set for myself about what is the purpose of a committal, to try and find a way, well, how do we turn that into something that it's a debate? How do we actually turn that into something where there is actually structure, or it's not just a case of saying, well, there's various purposes and it depends on what you think. How do we actually structure that? So that's my challenge in the workshop this week, is to shape this into something with a bit more dynamic energy behind it, and with more of a point to it. That's not just, I'm just informing you of something that you could have just looked up for yourself. All right, so I will see you in class this week.